Hello, this is Thelma English with Brit Lit, and welcome back, session 10. Today, we'll get our quiz done for Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and we'll have our introduction to Shakespeare, and that should be lots of fun. Let's open the class with just a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for the privilege to homeschool in America. Lord, I pray that you bless each of these students, whether they are in a group setting or whether they are an individual sitting in their room, watching and listening on their phone or their iPad or their desktop computer. Thank you, Lord, for this privilege in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, imitation of Christ. Somebody volunteered last week to read a devotion from the Imitation of Christ. Let's go ahead and pause the video for that now. Okay, let's get started again. Make sure that you get a volunteer for next week. If you are sitting alone in your room, listening to this by yourself or watching this by yourself, then I suggest that every week you read a devotion out loud during that time by yourself. Definitely do not miss Thomas à Kempis, The Imitation of Christ. Don't miss it just because you're not in a classroom setting. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, you have vocabulary words. Go ahead and turn those in now, please. Make sure your name is on your paper. If you don't know what I'm talking about with assignments, then your teacher or parent needs to email me, thelma@thelmaslibrary.com. Email me to get access for teacher materials. Actually, we're redoing the website, so I'll have to email those to you personally, but I will. If you are in a group setting or if you have a parent who is teaching you and you would like to follow along and also do all of the assignments and have the quizzes and the quiz answers and all of that, I'm more than willing to give you that material. You just have to ask. So let's turn in our vocabulary, Gawain vocabulary. Now we have a plot quiz for Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Yes, I do know this is from a video game, this image, but it's so cool because not only is it Sir Gawain, you can see the Virgin Mary painted on the inside of his shield, just like our knight, so that as he fights, he is remembering Mary, which is pretty cool. Okay, let's go ahead and pause the video now and take your 20-question quiz. Okay, how was the quiz? It wasn't hard, was it? The quiz is really just a reading quiz. If I was your mom or your grandma and I was there with you, I would ask you some questions after you finished reading the story, and then I would know if you read at a good enough level of understanding. However, since I cannot do that, the next best thing is to take a reading quiz. These are always low value, but it does get you to read a little bit better. I hope you enjoyed Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and I would highly encourage you to read other Arthurian literature about the Knights of the Round Table. It is pretty cool stuff. All right, session 10, we're going to be introducing ourselves to Shakespeare, and we'll be reading Much Ado About Nothing, and we'll be reading some of the sonnets. You've taken your quiz, you've turned in your vocabulary, you have your copy of Much Ado About Nothing with you. We're using the Dover copy. We will be using the Dover page numbers for the study guide. You can use a different edition of Much Ado About Nothing if you can figure out the questions. Without the page numbers, you may not be able to figure out the questions. The Dover copies do not have line numbers. They do divide the play into, of course, 5 acts. Every Shakespeare play has 5 acts, and within each act, every Shakespeare play has a number of scenes, 1 scene or 8 scenes in each act. And these are divided by act and scene, but they are not divided by line numbers. And so I'm using page numbers on the Dover. We use Dover copies to keep the cost down. If you have another copy of Much Ado About Nothing, I highly recommend the Folger editions, and you can usually pick those up at used bookstores for not too much. They don't live forever, but they do make those in a large print Folger edition. They're just a little bit harder to find on Amazon. If you search Much Ado About Nothing large print, you won't find the Folger edition. You need to go to the Folger Library website, find their editions for sale, find the ISBN number for the large print Much Ado About Nothing, or the large print As You Like It, and then copy that ISBN and take it back to Amazon, paste it into your search engine at Amazon, and then you'll be able to find it. And I think those are $10 instead of $5 or $6.99. They're $10 for the large print. Much nicer. I've switched over to the large print, but the Dover copy does just well for the next 2 weeks for us. You have syllabus page reading that's talking about the Elizabethan age. The Elizabethan age refers to the time that Elizabeth I was the queen, 1558 to 1603 at her death. That's the Elizabethan age, and that also is the age of Shakespeare. Shakespeare died in 1616, just a few years after that. And the King James Bible was 1611, just a little bit before that. So Shakespeare's right in there with the King James Version of the Bible. You have a Much Ado About Nothing study guide. You don't have too many questions on that study guide. It is due session 12. The second hour today, we should have time to be reading aloud in class. Or if you are an individual by yourself, you can start listening to the Mrs. E sound files. I do have 2 sound files, and I introduce each scene of Much Ado About Nothing. So I start the sound file and I say Act 1, Scene 1, and then I explain what is going to happen in that scene. You can either listen to my explanation of all the scenes and then read the play, or you can listen scene by scene, stop the audio, and then read that scene of the play. But that way you will understand what you are reading if you listen to me introducing the scenes. And this study guide is due in 2 weeks. Okay. Next week or next session, we're going to watch the Much Ado About Nothing DVD. So this week, you need to read the entire play. You will get started today, or you and your class will get started today. I won't be with you. And then you will read it on your own at home. You can pick up where you leave off today. Maybe you'll even get some questions answered today and work on your Much Ado About Nothing study guide. Then next week, the next session, you will view Kenneth Branagh's Much Ado About Nothing DVD. And that way you'll understand anything you didn't understand prior, then you will understand. And that's why your study guide is due the week after you view the video. So your Much Ado About Nothing study guide is due 2 weeks after today. You'll be reading from the Dover Sonnet edition next week, and we'll start talking about some sonnets, which is pretty cool. And next week, you'll be reading some syllabus page about Shakespearean theater and some of the sonnets. It's really pretty cool. All right, Much Ado About Nothing. This is the film version that I've chosen for us to watch. This is what I use in my own classes. This is produced by Kenneth Branagh. He also is the star. He plays Benedict. We have Kenneth Branagh, Michael Keaton. He's the guy who did one of the first Batmans. Keanu Reeves, Emma Thompson, Denzel Washington, some really good actors in this edition. It's a 1993 romantic comedy. It's rated PG-13. It's 1 hour, 51 minutes. We're going to watch that next session. I highly suggest that you fast forward through what I call the bouncing buns scene. The men come home from war, and you can tell by the cover here that they are on horseback. They come home from a war, 2 brothers at war against each other, and they've made peace. It's a romantic comedy. And so they've made peace and they all come home together. Now they're going to be friends. Well, we'll see if that lasts. But they're coming home. Shakespeare would have loved to have had galloping horses on his stage, but of course he couldn't do that. And so the scene where they come home from war, they're all dusty and dirty, and they start stripping off their clothes and jumping into this great big fountain. And the music is awesome. There are no words, a few yippies or something like that. There are no words because that's not part of the play. Shakespeare could not do that on the stage, but you're going to see some bare bottoms. If you watch that scene, lots of hairy, bare bottoms. And most girls think that's pretty gross. So when you get to what I call the bouncing buns scene near the beginning, you can just fast forward through that. You don't have to close your eyes. Just fast forward if you don't want to see all those bouncing buns. And then later on in the film, there is a party. There's a masked ball where they all wear masks, and you'll see an old man running around pinching an older lady on her rump with a little, oh, that type thing. And there is one scene in your teacher schedule notes, I actually describe the offensive things in case you want to fast forward through those sections. I have an edited edition myself so that those are no longer an issue. All right, an introduction to Shakespeare, 1564 to 1616. You have some structured notes today, and my lecture matches up with those structured notes. It's really to give you an idea of what Shakespeare is all about. So this is our introduction to Shakespeare. I'm showing you the most famous of the portraits, obviously because it's fun. This one isn't really very romanticized looking. The one here on slide 9, the one previous, well, that's not Shakespeare. We'll come up with some more. Shakespeare's education, this is right from your notes. Shakespeare's education would have been fantastic compared with us. Shakespeare knew what he was doing, and he was an excellent writer. Please don't listen to anybody that comes in to challenge the authorship of Shakespeare. There really isn't any logical way that that could have happened, regardless of what type of little mini documentary that you have seen. So his education would have included Latin. Everybody learned Latin, and classical mythology, so the Greek and Roman stuff. Holinshed's histories of England and Scotland, and it would include Ireland, but Shakespeare didn't use those. He used the histories of England and Scotland. So these are histories from the first century that didn't get published until the 1500s. It was kind of a collection, and people added to that, and then it finally got printed. But that's pretty cool. Shakespeare had access to that to learn that history. And then Plutarch's Lives of Noble Greeks and Romans. And that is another cool book you really should have on your shelf. What is classical mythology? You all know what Latin is. Classical mythology, by our standards, his education was exceptional. He was well taught in Latin, and it's possible that he learned a little tiny bit of Greek. But his education did include Greek and Roman mythology. The myths are mentioned or alluded to numerous times. Quite a few of the plays have lots of mythology mentioned. They will make comparisons of lovers, and they'll go into antiquity and talk about different lovers. Or in Midsummer Night's Dream, there's lots of classical mythology. And in Twelfth Night, there's lots of classical mythology. In Twelfth Night, a guy trying to, no, that's not Twelfth Night. In Merchant of Venice, there's classical mythology. A guy is trying to woo a girl, and he mentions all of these classical stories. And I have to stop when we're reading those aloud and explain each of those little classical stories as quickly as I can so that they understand what's being talked about. I don't know if it's better to do classical lit before you take Shakespeare, but I do know in Brit Lit, you're more than able to do much about nothing and as you like it. These are the easiest plays to read, the easiest to understand, and that way you've got at least 2 Shakespeare plays under your belt. And if you want to do more, I would suggest that you head for the comedies. Contact me if you want suggestions, and if I can offer you any help, I will. This is just some type of a cartoon thing of all the gods and goddesses. The older gods, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, are bearded usually because they're a little bit older. And let's see, Aphrodite is usually taking her clothes off. She's not here right now, but she would if she was. There she is in the corner, scantily clad. Athena is a warrior goddess. She always has that helmet, that griffin helmet on, and she's got a shield, and curled under the shield is a serpent. All of these people, perhaps you've heard about these, but well worth your time to learn some classical mythology. Then the Holinshed's histories of Scotland and England. Holinshed collected these from previous historians, and it's in 3 volumes, or you can get it in 1 volume. Every library should have this. Shakespeare and his contemporary writer, playwriter, Christopher Marlowe, both used this extensively in many of the plays. For Shakespeare, we see in King Lear, Macbeth, Cymbeline, King Lear and Macbeth especially, some of the character names are almost identical to the real people names in Holinshed's histories. And then Shakespeare kind of adds a little touch of Hollywood so that it's a little more exciting. He always does that. And it's really pretty cool. Plutarch's Lives of Noble Greeks and Romans. Plutarch was this crazy guy, this priest at Delphi in Greece. So if you take classical lit, I'm going to make that next year. If you take classical lit or have taken it from me, you know that at Delphi, which was thought to be the belly button of the world, the center of the world to the Greeks. Of course, for Jews, the center of the world is Jerusalem. For Americans, the center of the world of our map is always, America. But for the Greeks, the center of the world was Delphi. And so he was this priest at Delphi. So he'd sit over that, the Delphic oracle. If you've been to Greece with me, I've been there 3 times. If you've been to Delphi in Greece, then you know that Apollo's temple is still there, and Apollo was a god of prophecy. And they now know that there was a fissure in the earth underneath there. And so there was natural gas coming up. So the priests and the priestesses were actually getting high before they gave their oracles. It's really a pretty cool story, but that's another class. So Plutarch, this priest at Delphi in Greece, was devoted to history and historical figures. He wrote comparative biographies of Julius Caesar, Antony, and Cleopatra. And these were, excuse my writing, I just did this up this morning, changed this and added a little picture. And I see my grammar is poor. You'll have to excuse me. And Cleopatra, they were all used extensively by Shakespeare. So when Shakespeare writes Antony, Cleopatra, or in Julius Caesar, which are great plays, the great plays, when he writes those up, he's just stealing right from Plutarch, which is cool. It was okay to do. It wasn't considered to be plagiarism. It was considered to be a compliment to use someone else's material. That's why my materials are now out there for free. I want people to use them. I want future generations of kids to get well educated. Shakespeare, what did he call his plays? A playwright was not thought to be a great writer. If you wrote a poem for a great person who was in love and needed a poem to woo his lady, or someone died and you needed a Shakespeare poem for a eulogy to prove that that person was quite important and his loss is a very great one, those were thought to be high quality, educated writing. Shakespeare called his plays his foul papers. And that's what we all want to read today, his foul papers, his bad stuff. But his works have stood the test of time and are unrivaled in any language. He made no attempt to collect or preserve his writings. His friends did that after his death. He died in 1616, and in 1623, 2 of his friends put the works all together because they realized they're all going to be lost. Writing plays in the Elizabethan era, his plots and stories are very rarely actually original, but he adds the things that makes them sell tickets. That copyright and plagiarism were absolutely unknown. The entire concept of plagiarism would have seemed foreign. As I mentioned before, it was a compliment to use someone's work. His imaginative mind composed few, if any, new plots or stories, and he takes old poems, stories, histories, or plays and makes them over quickly. For example, the tragedy of the rich Jew of Malta, as it was played before the king and queen, his majesties. So here's a play, The Tragedy of Malta, written by Christopher Marlowe. Have you ever heard of that? No, because no one performs that anymore. Nobody performs that because The Merchant of Venice, that Shakespeare wrote from the same story, is much better and sold more copies, and people are still reading it and performing it today. It is racist. It is racist against Jews, but it also reflects a very important time period in early modernity or late medieval times, whichever you want to call the late 1500s, early 1600s. It's right there on the threshold of modernity. It does reflect the place of Jews in Europe and how much they were hated and looked down upon and spit on by people, even in the street. It gets pretty bad. And so I think it is important for us to read The Merchant of Venice. Plus, it's a great play. You do have to feel a little bit sorry for Shylock, the main Jewish character who is the evil person in the play. However, he's so evil that you don't feel too sorry for him for too long. So they call it a difficult play, but I would encourage you to read it anyway. Within a few years of writing plays, Shakespeare is leading all the dramatists and poets, writing play after play so rapidly that good work seems impossible. His first play, oh my goodness, his first play, everybody dies. Everybody has their tongue cut off and their hands cut off so they can't talk or write, about what's happened to them. Evil, evil bad guys. It was like he He wasn't sure how long his career would be, and so he threw everything into that first play. Kind of crazy, and nobody reads it much. So within a few years, he's leading everybody, writing better plays and writing play after play. More than 1,000 scholars have spent their lives collecting, identifying, and classifying Shakespeare's works. How he did it is still the unanswered question. There are two theories for the genius of the works of Shakespeare. One is that he was just a genius. The great works he produced were from his own creativity and intellect, that he just did it. B, that he lived at the right time in the right place. These outside influences account for the genius of his works. What do you think? What do you think? Well, it's both of those, isn't it? He lived at the right time in the right place. Let's see. That's a double, excuse that little issue on slide 18. Morality, mystery, and miracle plays of the 15th and 16th centuries had depicted biblical scenes and stories. We read some of those earlier this year. We read Everyman. We read this Dover edition of Everyman, and then some other miracle and morality plays. Those were all about the Bible, or about miracle stories that surrounded issues in the Bible and biblical stories. It was a perfect medium to reach large numbers of people inexpensively. And you remember that when we did Everyman, we talked about it almost like a Sunday school. If you have people who cannot read, they don't have the printing press perhaps yet, they can't read and write, and they can't have their own copies of things, even once things are being printed, how do you tell them the stories of the Bible? It's almost like a Sunday school class or a VBS, a vacation Bible school, where you perform these things. You perform these and everybody repents and gets saved at the end, or they don't repent and the devil comes up out of the floorboards with some smoke and some stinky stuff, and they get dragged down to hell screaming. And so that was a morality, mystery, and miracle plays. Well, people decided the play was really a good way to entertain people, but maybe they could venture beyond the Bible for stories. And I have to say, I think he lived at the right time in the right place, and he was genius. He lived at the close of the Renaissance and Reformation. This is a depiction of Queen Elizabeth. And of course, the Renaissance was that movement in the North, specifically Italy, specifically Florence, Italy, and even more specifically at the Academy where Michelangelo's David is housed. And the Reformation would have been more in the North, think Germany and Switzerland, these two movements happening at the same time. And Shakespeare has access to both of these and a printing press to print everything up. So he lived at the close of the Renaissance and Reformation. One thing you need to know is the Act of Supremacy. Here we have King Henry VIII. That's during the life of Martin Luther in 1534. The Act of King Henry VIII declaring that he was the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. The church would not allow him to get a divorce, so he stomped his little foot and said, I'm starting my own church. So there, and started the Church of England. Opportunity was now there to present some secular material. Queen Elizabeth was very open to this, presenting plays with some secular material, non-biblical subject material that had just gained acceptance during the Renaissance. So the Renaissance is the revival of all those Greek and Roman things, the Greek and Roman stories, and they're being printed now in Latin, and everybody can read them in school. Everybody knows the stories of the gods and goddesses and Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra and all those people. And so you've got a lot of fodder to write some good stories and write some good plays. Then comes along that invention of the printing press, 1476, and Shakespeare had access to books in school because of that printing press. So he's able to learn all of these cool stories. Here we have an opening page to the tragedy of Macbeth. And of course, this comes from Histories of Scotland. Greek classics are translated now. All of a sudden, after 2,000 years, they'd been hidden in Greek only. And then all of a sudden you have them translated into Latin and then into English. And you have the printed word of God, which had birthed the Reformation. The printing press is a huge, big deal. William Caxton translated then things, printed texts of Greek ideas and culture were a major force in the humanistic movement that we call the Renaissance, the rebirth of all things ancient Greek and Roman, pagan Greek and Roman things. But these Greek classics were translated, and now everybody knows the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid. They know all the stories of all of these cool things, and you don't have to read Greek anymore to know them. And all the tragedies, the Greek tragedies, All of these things are materials that now Shakespeare had access to. Shakespeare embodies all the best of both forces: Reformation morality and principles from the Bible, creativity and humor from the Renaissance revived masters like Plutarch. North's translation of Plutarch's Lives came out in 1579. Plutarch lived in that first century, so this is a lot of history. And then the historian Holinshed. Elizabeth's reign, 1558 to 1603, was characterized by intellectual liberty and progress. Here's an image of a famous image of Queen Elizabeth. People always want to know why she's so white. She had, I believe it was smallpox, you might have to look it up, that left all types of marks on her face, which she believed ruined her beauty. And so she has white makeup, like you might use for sunblock, that white stuff. She has it all over her face to try to cover her face. And I believe, let's see, it's not zinc. Oh, it's something, it's made out of something horrible. There's some people believe she died from poisoning from her makeup. How's that for a story about makeup? The Spanish Armada, which they won, her army won, and that made her more popular. And that also brought a national pride, a renewal and a national pride. When you go fight a war and you win really big. So this war at sea, they won victoriously. And there was a renewed interest in drama. The first theaters opened in 1574. The Puritans were no longer in charge in England. Some of them are getting angry right now in 1574 to have all the drama on stage. Some of them will be so angry about all the things in Britain becoming so anti-godly and anti-Bible that in 1620, some of them, that's just another 40 or 50 years from now, will be sailing off to America by 1620. So we have a lot going on in the world during this time. But Elizabeth was open to new things. She was not Catholic. She was the daughter of Henry VIII, one of his daughters. She ruled over what we can now call the Tudor dynasty from 1558 to 1603. The dynasty perished with her, the Tudor dynasty, because she did not marry and she did not have any children. It was a time of intellectual liberty and progress, continued exploration, religious tolerance and comfort. It was a time of poetry and patriotism at home and abroad. It was a good time to be in England, especially if you weren't particularly religious. You didn't have to really pretend anymore. With the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, English pride from victory over their old enemy brought this renewed patriotism. The first theater opened when Shakespeare was only 10 years old, and that was at its height during her reign. And we do know that Shakespeare early on as a child was working at the theaters. The printed text of Greek ideas and culture is a huge big deal for inspiring Shakespeare. He embodies the best really of both forces. He has pretty much Reformation morality and principles from the Bible. If you're a bad guy, you can't die on stage. If you're a good person and you die, you can have a beautiful death scene with all types of lines and die really slowly, that type of thing. If you're a bad person and you treat women horribly, none of that horribleness will be on stage. They'll talk about it and then, see them come out on stage later. Principles really basically from the Bible. When they're talking about marriage, they do think bodily functions and things like that are funny. So they will say some things, but they don't really, it will not be very often that Shakespeare will insult or trivialize or profane something that we as Christians hold to be sacred. And he gets creativity and humor inspiration from the Renaissance, that resurrection of all of those gods and goddesses. Those are funny stories. So he's got this timeless appeal, and that's the romantic of Shakespeare. I think it's the Chandois portrait with a little earring in his ear, and he's got on a poet shirt, and oh my goodness, his top button is unbuttoned. That's a big deal. This is one snapshot from Kenneth Branagh's Much Ado About Nothing. This is Claudio and Hero. He's a keen observer of human character, tragic, romantic, and comic. Shakespeare studied the crowds and he gave them just what they wanted. In reflecting the diverse Elizabethan crowds, he reflected on crowds everywhere, thus his timeless appeal. He observed human development in various situations and capitalized on exercising emotions, whether they were tragic, romantic, or comic. And remember, this is a play. You only have a couple of hours to do it. So everything has to happen really, really, really fast. And that makes it funny. That makes the comedies funny. You realize, oh my goodness, they're in love already. Oh my goodness, they're going to get married in 6 days. Oh my, multiple weddings. A lot of the comedies, probably most of the comedies, end with marriages. Many of the comedies, it might be all the comedies except Much Ado About Nothing, have a woman dressing as a man so that she can go save the day. So Shakespeare likes strong female characters, which is kind of cool. All of the actors were male. There were no females on the stage. So if you had to have a girl, you wouldn't have anybody so beautiful as this little hero here on slide 30. You would have a boy who was tall and thin, whose voice had not changed yet, and you'd dress him up like a lady. So you certainly wouldn't have any nude scenes or bouncing buns or anything like that on stage. But he was great at reflecting a real tragedy. He has a gift for writing tragedy and making you almost hold your breath because the tragedy is so heavy. And then he'll throw in a little comic relief with a short scene of something that's kind of sort of funny so that you can take a deep breath. Romance, you name it, he can do it. You will love Claudio's lines at how he's barely seen Hero. Before he went to war, he looked at her and thought she was pretty. And he comes home from war, and now all I can think about is marrying her and that he loves her and all of that goo goo gaga. Or comedy. He knows how to make fun of people. He really knows how to make fun of people. To create comedy, you take reality and then you just make it bigger and exaggerate it a little bit. And Shakespeare is great at that. London provided country and city life for Shakespeare to observe. Stratford is only 94 miles from London. Stratford is where Shakespeare ends up buying a big house and living. London was the political center, basically, of the world. He grew up around the Forest of Arden and the city, and many of the plays are going to take place in the Forest of Arden. And As You Like It, everybody has to run away from the city for one reason or another, so they don't get killed or so they can hide or whatever. And they all end up in the Forest of Arden, and they find each other here and there. And a lot of the comedy has to do with that aspect. And of course, a girl is dressed up as a guy, and trying to act like a guy is quite funny. And she takes her fool in the forest with her. You can see the fool here with his 3-pointed, hat, so that everybody knows that he is a fool. He can say whatever he wants and get rid of it and get away with it, and not be beheaded or something like that. So he grew up in the Forest of Arden, and he places a lot of the action of many of his plays in the Forest of Arden, which is really fun. He's a poet. Shakespeare's a keen observer of our fallen human nature. He knows why bad guys make choices that they do, and he can come up with terrible things. He has one character, of course, we don't read that play, but he has a character, Aaron, who says the thing that he really loves to do. And I'm not even going to tell you what play this is in because I can't remember it off the top of my head, where he says, what I really like to do is dig up somebody's best friend, carve into their chest something like, miss me yet, and then prop them up on their doorstep, on their best friend's doorstep. Just evil, evil, evil. Shakespeare really knows how to make evil guys. And of course, we're not going to read any of that. We're just going to read these 2 comedies this year. This scene would be, you can tell right when you look at it, after you've read the play, you'll know this is As You Like It. He can make us laugh or cry as we watch exaggerated human nature on the stage. And that is how you create humor. You just take something real and exaggerate it to death. This is obviously another line from another scene from As You Like It. This is Rosalind, who's dressed up like a boy, wearing the little, short outfit with the tall boots, and with her best friend, Celia, and then Touchstone the clown in As You Like It. Shakespeare is incredible at writing intricate plots and subplots. Lots of subplots, lots of intricate plots, all done without a computer. He can remember and reflect in drama every significant detail about characters, about the scenes, the settings, the plots, the subplots, and they all work out together in the end. He does a great job of that. He doesn't have any holes. Sometimes when you watch a movie and you feel like, well, that couldn't really happen because of this that they showed us earlier. Shakespeare doesn't do that. He doesn't have any plot holes. He does really good. Shakespeare's timeless appeal also, he is one of the 4 greats. You have up here carven images of Sophocles, Euripides, and Aeschylus, the 3 great tragedians who followed one after the other. Their careers overlapped, all from Athens, Greece, and all from 4 to 300 BC. That's another class, that's classical lit, but they're the great tragedians. And the fourth of the four greats is Shakespeare. That's it. He's forever awarded a place in literary history, which is unapproachable by other drama writers since his lifetime. Classical drama had a severe simplicity. This is a very well preserved theater at Epidaurus, Greece. You can, if you walk out into the middle of that performance circle and drop a dime, even the people up in the nosebleed seats can hear it. And if you sing a song, everyone can hear it. They had a knack for building their theaters into hillsides. Most of these theaters have been picked over and destroyed by people going after the marble slabs, because the marble is already cut and shaped. And so for other buildings, you could go up to an old Greek theater and just rob it of all the marble. But here at Epidaurus, it's way up on a hillside. And so it was not taken all apart and robbed from. So you can still go there and just walk all the way up there. It's, if you have a fear of heights, that's where it's going to happen. But it had a very severe simplicity. Classical drama, it was all pretty much tragedy, and they had very strict guidelines. A play could only represent a few hours, no more than a day, a few hours or a day. Characters couldn't change. A boy couldn't grow up and become a man. That takes a long time. The man's circumstances couldn't change, and violent action was considered to be unacceptable for the stage. So you had people being murdered and battles taking place off stage, and then they're later reported by a messenger. So if you take classical lit, for example, and we read the guy who gets killed in the bathtub, I'm going to pause this and find his name. Okay, that's Agamemnon. In Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, in the Iliad, Agamemnon is a big main king, and he goes off to war and fights for 10 years trying to get his wife back. And he does, and they live happily ever after, and it's all her fault, and she doesn't get in trouble for it because she's a demigoddess. And so it's not her fault that she's the most beautiful woman in the world, that type of thing. But Agamemnon, he comes back from war, and there's a play called Agamemnon, and he comes back from war. And he says, honey, I'm home. I've been gone 10 years. And she's got a tapestry, a beautiful tapestry thrown out before. Think of that circular play. Think of the circular play. I'll take you back to that. Think of the circular stage. And they've got a skene, a building at the end there where those buildings would be, but it would be up toward the back of the circle. And she throws out this beautiful tapestry, obviously embroidered by hand, took years to make. And he's kind of thinking, maybe I shouldn't walk across that. It's like, that's maybe for the gods and not me. And it's a red, the audience would be thinking, no, don't walk on that. Don't walk on that. You'll be killed if you walk on that because you're not a god. And he also says, honey, look, I got the big prize. Look what I got. And he's got the most beautiful priestess as a prize. And he brought her home and expects his wife to be happy for him. And so he walks into the building, the skene at the end, like one of these buildings down there, but it would be on the circle. And he walks into the building. And then you hear this screaming, oh, ouch, 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 ooh. And then, you've got water flowing out the door, all red, and I don't know, maybe some bubbles in a rubber ducky or something. But he comes home and his wife has murdered him in the bathtub, which would be the utmost humiliation for a warrior, to not die bravely in battle, but to die when you get home by your own wife in the bathtub naked. So most of these were very dramatic. Bloodshed and battles, they take place off stage, and then a messenger would run in and say what just happened. English drama, Shakespeare's drama, sought to represent broad sweeps of time in a single play. Scenes changed, time changed, years flew by, all to entertain. It was not to educate us. It wasn't to provide a moral compass. It wasn't like Everyman, where we learned that we better know Jesus or we're going to hell. It was not like that. It's not to provide a moral compass. A man's life could be portrayed in a 2-hour production on stage. An actor could portray first one character and then another. The audience would willingly suspend their disbelief for the sake of the entertainment. Drama had progressed from classical antiquity to the church, and from the church to Renaissance-influenced writers and actors. We are approaching the man born in the right place and at the right time. The man who crosses barriers, reflecting the glory and artistic beauty of the Renaissance and all those cool characters and stories, and the morality of the Reformation. If you're a bad man, you're going to die off stage, and they're going to, in Macbeth, they're going to cut your head off, put it on a pole, march in with the head on a pole, and say, well, we ran into him, and we had this fight, and he killed him, and here he is, it's all over, and now we have a new rightful king. Most of the things that offend Christian audiences and readers, the trivializing or profaning of things we hold to be sacred, will not be found in Shakespeare's works. These offenses are made by modern directors and writers, and who seek to update Shakespeare's works to reflect modern worldviews. Shakespeare does employ some coarse humor and adult themes that were not considered to be offensive in his own day. And we'll see that a little bit in Much Ado About Nothing, that the maid will tease Hero in the morning of her wedding day. She'll tease her about married life things, and we would consider that inappropriate, but they will do that. Couples who are in love will wait until marriage to consummate their vows, but many suggestive comments may be made during the wait. Bodily functions will be held up as objects of humor because you can make people laugh, just like little boys pretending to fart into their hands or with their underarms. Everybody laughs at that, and so Shakespeare does it. Male actors portraying female characters will dress their characters as men to gain freedom of passage in the male-dominant Elizabethan age. This is a girl dressed up to be, she's Rosalind, and she's dressed up to be a boy, Ganymede. In this way, Shakespeare's strong female characters have the freedom to travel, to control the action of the play, and to save the day. Think about it. A girl in the 1600s can't run off into the forest with her cousin and go live alone. But if one of them dresses up as a boy and pretends to be a boy, then they can socially, and they won't be accosted, and one of them can carry a sword and try her best to pretend to be a boy. And that creates lots of humor. That would be an As You Like, and that's coming right up. Christian audiences have enjoyed Shakespeare's works for more than 400 years. This is a guy dressed up as a lady, and just looking at him is actually quite funny. I do recall one play in Ashland that I think it was Henry the Fourth. I don't remember which play it was. It was one of the Falstaff plays, and they have the lady who runs the local Ladies of the Night whorehouse comes out on stage, and they used all men for the production, just as in Shakespeare's day. And when this guy comes out dressed as a lady, so he's supposed to be a prostitute, a lady of the night, the one that runs the place, and he is huge. He's tall, and he's really muscly. He's big and muscly, and he has this costume that is just a ridiculous costume. It's actually laced up the back, and every time he twirls around back, you can see that he has army tip fatigues underneath and army boots in front. But then when he turns frontward, he looks like just a overly large lady of the night, with a low-cut dress stuffed with socks, kind of obviously that type of thing, with makeup absolutely painted on. He makes just a pathetic image of a woman, but it creates humor, incredible humor. And at the Elizabethan stage in Ashland, Oregon, that guy, when he came out on stage, there was one guy right down front in a front row seat who just laughed and laughed and laughed. And they kind of had to pause the acting of the play to wait for this guy to quit cracking up, because it was so hilarious. So Shakespeare knows what he's doing. His personal life. What about Shakespeare's personal life? This is Anne Hathaway's cottage. Kind of preserved, parts of it I'm sure are original, but preserved all of these years. They got married when he was 18. Anne was 26. And as you can kind of sort of guess, their first child was born sooner than 9 months. He was in London from 1587 to 1611. Did he live in London because he was unhappy in his marriage? Some people will say, oh, he writes all of these crack up, funny, bad marriage stories because his marriage was bad. But authors don't really write just what is their own life. We call that an autobiography. Think about all of the books you've read. Do people really write their own life story? Very rarely, unless it's an autobiography. So Shakespeare had quite a bit of imagination. He did live in London. Appears that he had to live in London for the plays. Others dispute this because he later retired to the country in 1611 after purchasing the largest house in Stratford 4 years earlier. It was customary for dramatists to depict marriage and family life as less than ideal for the amusement of the audience. That doesn't mean his family life was less than ideal. Think of all the other authors you know. Is that really? No, they have imaginations. This is an Elizabethan inn in London. London would have looked like this in those late 1500s, early 1600s. London, even now, is a dusty, filthy, stinky place. When it's raining in London, I've only been there for 1 week, one visit 1 week. But when it was raining, we all had our umbrellas up, and they actually touch each other. All the umbrellas touch each other. That's how crowded London is during the day. Everybody swarms into London for all of their jobs. But of course, in the 1587 to 1611, you would have dirt streets and horses and buggies and people throwing out the pots, the bed pots and things like that after night. It was even smellier and ickier. Think about the time of Shakespeare. It's also the time of the King James Version of the Bible. I told you Queen Elizabeth died in 1603. Well, King James, her nephew, the idea is that she's dying on her bed. She didn't marry, she didn't have any kids. And they say, Elizabeth, Elizabeth, who's going to follow after you? Who's going to succeed you? And she says, my nephew, James. And so James he was the King of Scotland, and he becomes the King of Scotland and Britain. And in 1611, he authorized a new Bible translation, which we call the King James Version of the Bible. And it has, if you get a real one, it has about 2 pages of praise James for this and praise James for that. Shakespeare was writing and performing prolifically. He gained an understanding and sympathy of city life and its problems quickly, just as he had in the country. So he can portray life in the country perfectly, and he can portray life in the city perfectly. And in some plays, for example, in As You Like It, they are in the city to begin with, and then they all have to run away to the forest of Arden, 1 or 2 at a time here and there, and then they all run into each other in the country. And he can portray city people, and he can portray country bumpkins absolutely perfectly. Within 5 years, he had been accepted into the Gentry Society and had risen to the top of his contemporaries. There were a lot of people writing plays, and Shakespeare was the best. He observed in life, and he recreated that on stage, exaggerated a little bit to make comedy, exaggerate tragedy a little bit to make tragedy, and he was absolutely perfect. Mannerisms and expressions of high society, he also could do perfectly. His poem, Venus and Adonis, was dedicated to the Earl of Southampton. This brought him recognition before his plays because it's poetry, it's real literature, right? His dedication of Venus and Adonis to the Earl of Southampton may have encouraged a substantial money gift. He may have gotten a gift of money after that poem, which some have speculated to be the seed money of his further investments. As I said, poetry was real literature. It's no coincidence that his narrative poetry was written during the time of the plague, when theaters would close for a while. Every time the plague broke out, this was a big, serious deal because there are no antibiotics, and people didn't understand the plague was coming from rats with plague contaminating the water, and they drink it. And you've read about the plague, so hopefully in your history. But when the plague would break out, anybody who had a country home would head out to the country and stay there until the plague was done. And the poor people who lived tight quarters in the city, throwing the bed pots and the urine out into the street every morning, just think of the contamination and the germs and the way things spread, and the lack of proper washing and the lack of proper everything and hand washing and all of that, and no antibiotics. People who had enough money to go to the country would go to the country. And that's when he wrote poetry. The sonnets do bring, if we're watching the video, the next week, bring your Dover copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. They really are great. You should start reading them now. Let's look at the format of a sonnet. We just have a little bit more to go here. And this is Sonnet 18. And it's one of my favorites, and it's really cool. If you have your Dover edition with you, this is on page 9. This is written in iambic pentameter. You know, penta is 5. So this is 5 metrical feet. You see the slashes there, and of the phrase for 5 phrases. And each of those little phrases has just 2 syllables, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So 10 syllables in each line divided into 5 feet of 2 syllables each. Excuse me. Then also 3 quatrains, little poetry paragraphs that have 4 lines each, and then a couplet, a rhyming couplet at the end, which also summarizes all of the content of the above 3 quatrains. Nobody does this like Shakespeare. So let's look at this. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. And you can see that line 1 and 3 rhyme, and line 2 and 4 rhyme. And then again, line 5 and 7 line, and line 6 and 8 rhyme. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy, so everything gets old and everything fades, but thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. If when you get old, you're going to be beautiful and you're never going to hell. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Isn't that cool, that rhyming couplet at the end? As long as this poem lives, then you'll be alive. Cool sonnet. What about theaters? Here is a stamped sample of the Globe Theater. This is the Swan, but it looks just like the Globe. Shakespeare soon invested in the Globe and the Blackfriars theaters. They had to be outside of the city because they were thought to be watching plays was kind of low life stuff, even though the Queen and then King James enjoyed that. It was thought to be a little bit of a low life activity. So they couldn't be right in the middle of the city. They had to be just across the river. So he invested in these theaters. The original site of the Globe has actually been found. And now, I think about 20 years ago, they have a new replica of the Globe on the location of the old Globe that draws large crowds from around the world. If you go to London and want to see a play at the Globe, you will need months of advance notice to be able to get tickets. And hopefully it would be something good and worth your time. I've got a big green arrow here pointing to the Globe. You can see how close it is to London Bridge and over the Thames River. It looks like Thames. It's the Thames River. And of course, now there are more bridges, but this is Shakespeare's London. This replica opened in 1997. So let's see, 07, 17, 25 years ago. Makes every effort to replicate seating. And that means most people stand. Staging, costumes, so they're itchy and scratchy costumes. Opinions have varied as to the success of this. Maybe they should modernize it a little bit and have some padded seats and cold drinks and things like that. The Globe. So the original was $15.99, and here's your 1997 version. When we went to London, we were unable to get tickets, and I don't know what was playing there if we were interested in it, but we didn't have time anyway. Globe, a sketch from 1599. People drew pictures of the Globe and left them in their journals, and that's how we kind of know what it looked like. This is from somebody's sketchbook, and that's how we know what the inside of the Globe looked like, which is really pretty cool. In 1597, Shakespeare was able to buy the biggest home in Stratford. And what did he name it? The man with a 30 to 40,000 word vocabulary, he called it New Place. That's a little bit of a wonder, isn't it? Why someone with that much talent and someone who does so well with syntax and word construction and creating words, creating phrases that we still quote today. Things like, if you ever say, I've been eaten out of house and home, that's Shakespeare. Well, there's so many things that are from Shakespeare, but he called it New Place. And he was able to have enough money. He released his parents from debt. That was a big deal. His home visits became more frequent. He obtained a coat of arms for his father, which meant that Shakespeare then could inherit that title from his father, because being a playwright, he could not get a coat of arms himself. It was kind of the low life way to make a living, but he was very famous. So it's kind of like when somebody makes it big in sports or Hollywood and they pay off their parents' mortgage, that type thing. That's what he did. The Winter's Tale, from there, Shakespeare, from his home in Stratford, after 1611, he wrote all of his cool later comedies. The Winter's Tale, his late romances, they're not late comedies. His late romances, Things like A Winter's Tale, which is a pretty cool play. So the people that you think are dead don't actually die, and you don't find out till the end. So it kind of has a tragic little aspect in there, and yet it all works out in the end, and nobody holds anything against anybody. And there he lived the life of a country gentleman. The Tempest, another one of these late romances. The Tempest, this is a great one. It's one of his last works, and it was one of 5 accounts of a real life shipwreck that left survivors on a Bermuda island for 10 months. The same wreck inspired Daniel Defoe to write Robinson Crusoe in 1719, that same wreck. And that's a great book if you haven't read that one yet. 100 years later, in 1611, Shakespeare sold his interest in the theaters. This is an image of Prospero and his daughter Miranda. After this shipwreck, they've lived on this island alone. And then, of course, Prince Charming happens to also be, they land there. I can't remember their ship. They land there, and the young prince and Miranda meet, and of course fall in love and all of that. And her dad, Prospero, has all these demands, things that her lover has to do to satisfy him, that he would be a good husband. And of course, she's never even seen a man before except for her dad. So it's really a pretty cool play. Shakespeare's death, 1616. He has a place in the Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. He died on his 53rd birthday, April 23rd. This is on a lot of calendars, 1616. He probably left several works unfinished. We think Henry VIII, and then the missing play, Cardenio, would be one of his last works. Okay, now I want you to take the rest of the time for this class, and I want you to open up your books of Much Ado About Nothing. And I know you'll be stumbling a little bit, but I would like you to divide up parts and begin reading that. If you are at home alone, or there are only 2 of you or something, you can start listening to the Thelma audio that introduces each scene. Listen to all of the scene introductions if you like, or listen to them one by one, and then read the play, and next week view the movie. Thank you. Okay, Lord bless you. See you next week.